The road of the gifted transmuting talent was my first assignment. Enigmatic, I'm a working quagmire. Sired with a flair, it took time to realize my eyes burned. A reflection of the journey have me seeing gasoline roads. Had to acquire skin that was fireproof, making steady roads, yet volatility sits in my eyes, sometimes compelled to divide and just fall apart. The moments that hangs on the soul, so many ways to be right with so many roads. How could one be wrong? How could one go wrong?
It's interesting to I suppose there's this resonance with other descriptions of roads and possibilities in literature and in poetry. I like the ambivalence of the position you come to in the poem. It doesn't say that one couldn't be wrong. In fact, you might be saying, how is it possible that the road I've taken is the wrong road? It could be, how could this one be wrong? I assumed that none would be wrong. I like the idea that any of them could, any road can be wrong. I think so obviously there's much before, and I'm hearing the piece for the first time, and much of the imagery and such, which is also very interesting to me. The gasoline roads, for instance, and its resonance with your description of your burning eyes, but at least in terms of its resolution, the way that the piece resolves, it's not. It's not a piece that suggests the impossibility of making the wrong choice, which I think is important to note. So
It's actually, this piece was somewhat inspired by the mundane, one might call it, but I would argue different than somebody like yourself or myself. Yet, but yes, inspired by the mundane, yet a potential stone or pebble in terms of adversity, depending on how you look at it. Because in one sense, you can go wrong by choosing any road. Should I say, you can't go wrong by choosing any road.
yes,
While
yeah.
experiencing a limited existence if in possession of a vision that requires a specific road.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, it in a sense, it's equivocal. All roads are both always right and always wrong.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think that our contemporary, as the phrase goes, the toxic positivity that infects our culture generally, at least it infects it as an kind of overburden of ideology in the expression of emotion,
Mm.
would like all resolutions to be part of a grand plan that is essentially good, which is, of course, an absurdity from my perspective, and I think from any rational perspective. Maybe there are faith-based positions that would see things otherwise, but I don't have one of those. So, yeah.
It's interesting. Um, I alluded to, where what I was curious about earlier on, the two titles, Anon and Plain Sight. Like,
Hmm.
I sense there's more to your titles, and I was really curious what inspired those titles for your book.
Different things. I mean, and with respect to so Anon is a kind of the first part of this, or the first part. Anon has a sequel of a sort, which is this book Coda. Um,
Okay.
and but Anon is also, but Plain Sight is also titled in an interesting way, perhaps. Obviously, it is playing off of the notion of hidden in plain sight,
Mm,
but it is that work is very different from Anon and from Coda. Anon, Coda, and the previous works I mentioned, Itch and Situ, are all four of those books are uh, a kind of continuous progression of fragments. Not exactly propositions as they happen in much philosophical literature in Descartes or Spinoza, say, or even in Wittgenstein, but more more fragmentary, less connected, one piece to the next. In plain sight, it's even less so, and that really is a work of aphorism, in uh, which has a different tradition, I think,
mm,
than say the kind of essay driven, if you will, fragmentary work that's in, say, people like Chamfort, or more recently, say, Maurice Blanchot sometimes, uh, uh, um, as opposed to Derrida or Lyotard or Nietzsche most of
mm,
the time. So, and there's an interesting aspect of the aphoristic tradition, I think, which allows it to, and for me, this is true in plain sight, allows it to speak to uh, an ethical position, that is to say, a social position,
yeah.
with respect to the way in which people work broadly politically. And uh, uh, it's a dark book, and it is and it, to some extent shares with my other work a focus also on epistemology and the questions about how we know things and what we do with what we think we know, how we position ourselves in relationship to a knowledge claim, right? Which is also a power claim, always. Um, and not always a claim to domination, but always a claim to power, right? And sometimes domination too, though. And in plain sight, I suppose that there's a narrator who is contiguous with the narrative positions of my other works,
Yeah.
but is essentially pushing against the epistemology of seeing, the epistemology of clarity, and arguing for and seeking a position of of hiddenness as a mode of circumventing submission to power. So that's that's sort of what happened. That's an aspect of what's happening in plain sight. In Anon, there's and then in Coda subsequently, Anon begins really as a piece that is pivoting um, uh, off of Melville, off of and of the in, mostly Moby Dick, but also some of the other works, especially the late work, The Confidence Man, and proposing a narrative of kind of essential sea adventure, which which is entirely avoided through the text. It never happens. It's never, and ultimately admits that it was never going to happen. So it understands that narrative pose as a pretext under which other kinds of investigations can happen. Um, and then the narrative, which in to some extent it's a narrative of sorts, to some extent continues in Coda, um, uh, is uh, is able to admit that sense of pretext from the start. So it begins with that the fact that that what's about to be narrated, insofar as anything can be called plotted or otherwise, is itself always going to be contradicted and always going to be a fabrication, which in all of these cases brings the work back to the language of the work. So for me, these are lyric works, though they don't look like poetry because they're not lineated. They're written in sentences, which are, as you may have seen, chopped into blocks, that each of which ends in an ellipsis. But at the same time, they are metered. There's a prosody to that, uh, to the movement of that language. So it works in a very musical way.
You sort of have me curious about power,
Hmm.
and perhaps you can shed some light for me. Do you find there's a somewhat of a fluctuation pertaining to the importance um to one culture as opposed to the other, and what it plays in terms of juxtaposing, their behavioral tendencies somewhat, especially on a political level?
Hmm. In terms of how power is exercised in our cultures, in
Yes.
particular. Um, and you're in the UK. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm in the US, and we have, similar but slightly different
Yes.
modes
Not
of
necessarily a
expression.
specific one. I was just thinking about just culture in general,
Oh, no, no, of
my
course.
understanding. Yeah.
Yes. I think it does, but it does. I think, I mean, in a sense, that it is clearly something that happens in relationship to specific cultures and specific uh, um, groups within cultures, right? So, uh, we both, I think well, I suppose everyone in the world to some extent lives under the burden of the history of white supremacy, of European white supremacy. And there is, so it is power is a different thing for me than it is for you, obviously. I am not being identified by uh, by authorities, so to speak, by people with guns in the way that you are as a person of color in this culture. Um, uh, Nonetheless, obviously, it's still we're all subject to it, and we suffer differently, but we all suffer from. No one doesn't suffer due to white supremacy. It is a diminishment of everyone's life. uh, for as an example. I mean, I think that in my work, these kinds of very particular, extremely important things to talk about and extremely important issues to write about, though I don't write about them very particularly. That is to say, I think that what I have to say about power may have something to say to these other power relations, but I feel like my subject position makes it impossible for me to really speak to the experience,
Mhm.
of what it is to be in relationship to these authorities as a person of color. I just see it from the outside, and can find it execrable, but it's not like the experience from the inside, which I don't need to tell you. I just need to tell. I know. Obviously, as a writer, I can't write about it, so in a way that would make any sense. So
No doubt. No doubt. It is. I was just curious because as a philosopher,
yeah.
um, I just see that as you have a certain lens, and I've been trying to somewhat just kind of figure out the interaction of the two, like the creator as well as the and the lens of having being a philosopher as well as being a poet, a creator, and a
Yeah.
visual artist, you know, just sort of intertwine everything into one.
Yeah.
So I was thinking to myself, you know, as a philosopher, what is the intrigue or the topic of interest? Um, the lens, in terms of like the lens, your lens, and somewhat focus. Um, like, what do you necessarily your choice of focus in terms of like the world, and how does that somewhat interrelate to you on a philosophical level somewhat?
Yeah, I mean, and I asked this question just because that's very broad. So, thinking about how to the direction to answer it. I mean, you mean in particular in relationship to how I understand my work as a writer and as an artist. Do you think is that what you're asking about, or in a broader sense?
I suppose in terms of like just the world around you, and
Yeah.
how do you think like you being that person plays in somewhat like like your interests and the things that you selectively are interested about?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, of course, those interests in part come from my personal history and my history uh, through and what I've both been exposed to and exposed myself to over the course of my education and my juvenescence. Uh, I this literature I came to philosophical literature at the same time I became aware of poetry, and both happened accidentally and outside of any institutional context when I was young. And I was so I was lucky not to have any clear distinction made. I mean, obviously there are distinctions between these uh, modes of discourse and different tropes within those modes of discourse and discursive conventions. But for me, reading, say, Emily Dickinson and uh, in Ceylon and Baraka and a whole list of others, and say Olson, while also reading Joyce and Melville and Kant.
Mm,
All of these figures seemed to be experimenting in ways that weren't fully distinguished from one another. I only came to later realize that other people didn't see these modes of discourse and approaches to the world as coextensive with one another, or as even the same line. Um, so it can sometimes still seem surprising to people when I have that conversation. To philosophers, for instance, when I speak of the stylistic experimentation that happens through the Western philosophical tradition, even in the canonical tradition. Um, and in ways that it doesn't occur to them to think of it that way, because they're really only thinking about the work not as language, not as as ways of experiments in expression, but as arguments that can be summarized.
mm,
Um, and that's not how I see my philosophical approach, or my approach philosophically to thinking through the problems that many of these traditions, uh, both in European philosophy and in other philosophical traditions from Africa or Asia or South America, also, for instance, also approach the world asking questions about knowledge, epistemological questions about existence, ontological questions about ethics and politics and things like that. So, but some of those other traditions are perhaps didn't undergo the same kind of radical separation between poetic discourse and philosophical discourse. What I will say, one thing though, I am interested in some of the discursive tropes of narrativity as well, and find them compelling in certain respects. The ossification of the novel around the way in which we understand conventional plot from the mid 19th century on makes it a mode of discourse that rarely produces anything interesting, and rarely experiments in any way at all that I find compelling. So I mentioned this already. I mentioned the book, The Confidence Man, by Herman Melville, and it's his last book. And Melville is an interesting figure because he sort of starts off with his simplest approaches in his early kind of adventure works, Typee and Omu, and then with each succeeding book, he he fails commercially a little bit more completely, till his final published novel in his life is essentially an utter disaster. No one, and so 20 years, then spends the next 20 years without publishing anything. Um, and that book, The Confidence Man, is this extraordinarily peculiar experimentation uh, in describing over and over again the ways in which our stories and our visions of our plotting of our lives and our attempts to circumscribe what we understand to be self with ideas about character, as stable character, are delusional and delusions that are propagated by the ways in which we tell stories. So he's constantly saying, I'm not giving you characters in the way you're used to, and that's because they don't. That's not something that exists in the world. I'm not, and so he's saying this is a philosophical project, not just an artistic project, so to speak. They're coextensive with one another. And I see my project as similar in that way. Like I think I end up sometime at worst, academic philosophers don't see my work as philosophy, and they understand that it's philosophical. They don't think it is, because it doesn't have arguments that can be summarized, in a manner of speaking. Although I would say that it does at times, and say poets don't see my work as poetry because poets actually are easier because they're much more broad-minded about what anything can be.
Yeah.
And I am too about that. So I understand some things that look exactly like poetry to people and read like poetry to people as philosophy. I would say, for instance, there are contemporary poets, many contemporary poets, who I would say are making philosophical claims of a certain kind, and
Mm.
and describing the world in ways that would have to be understood as philosophical and could be seen as making summary kinds of arguments. And some are also actually involved in the philosophy world. At least a few are.
Yeah.
Someone like Fred Moten, for instance, is a philosopher and a poet, and those things run into each other for him. I would say that's also true for Paul Celan, historically, and many other figures historically. And there are many other figures in contemporary American poetry. Those are just the reason I bring up Fred Moten, is that he is explicitly writing about philosophy as well as writing poetry. So he ends up, I think, making the connection is easier
Mm.
than it is with some other figures, who aren't explicitly writing philosophically critical work. But I think their poetry is doing that. I know I'm going on a bit here. I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're interested
No,
in.
no, but you know what? It's interesting because as much as you say it's not, maybe it's not the standardized version is probably what they're looking for per se. But
Yeah.
I think maybe because of your background and the different things that you bring to the table, your scope or your lens is somewhat going to be different, and your the expression of that, I think that's what they're probably seeing, and it's not necessarily the standardized version, and so they somewhat have a knee jerk to somewhat dispute or distance themselves away from it, maybe, or
Yeah.
they're intrigued in a way that make them be curious that is somewhat off-putting, perhaps. So I
Yeah.
don't necessarily think it's a bad thing.
Oh no, me neither. I think it's a good thing. You want to, it's a good thing to alienate people. People
Oh,
need to be
absolutely.
alienated. You have to piss them off. I mean, and not just piss them off, you have to confuse them. I don't like it when people think that makes them feel stupid, which it does sometimes. And that is by no means any intention. But being confused, people forget that how generative when they were young, say, when they were children, how generative confusion was for them. And it's something that it doesn't make someone in any way to not understand something at the first pass or to only understand it partially. People also think you're supposed to, and this is partially because of uh, um, the same regime of stupidity that governs commercial literature. Uh, they think you're supposed to understand things immediately, that language is supposed to be like breathing, like like that, and that all language is supposed to be like breathing, like the language that you find at the supermarket, like or in everyday conversation. That's fine,
Yeah,
but why should my poetry be that? And why should a narrative be that? It shouldn't. You should understanding something only partially is the beginning of a process, and it's a process that it's much more compelling than that. So I'm not of I really hate poetry that doesn't involve significant ambiguity. It can be many different styles of ambiguity,
absolutely.
but you know, uh, 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 there's so much terrible poetry out
Yeah,
there that it might as well be greeting cards. It's sad greeting cards. So
absolutely.
yeah,
Um, this is a somewhat of a just my view of things because, as I said, I was thinking about just the way how it all just kind of comes together. And maybe that's why it's hard to understand because it's somewhat of a chimeric type of mix, those things. And maybe it's not common because it's not necessarily done on a
Mm,
common scale sort of thing.
yes.
And it's like to me, the discipline or visual art aligned with philosophy is sort of like the X-ray vision or the super hearing to see the ghosts you hear in the room sort of thing pertaining to art, where the average senses may miss at these heights.
Right.
Even a heartbeat could be so loud that it's distracting. One may
Mm,
miss the art in the rawest form or rarest moments.
mm,
So it's a very meticulous and fine-tuned lens that you're working with, but it's one that you're probably not going to see often. So don't expect a lot of people to kind of just be like, oh man, I see it all. It don't
yes.
necessarily work like that when you're somebody of a unique, ilk, so to say.
Yeah.
So you just
Yes.
have to understand. We don't have too much time. We have about 2 minutes or so. Um, I'd love to hear, anything you have going on or you want to share.
Sure. In terms of like things that are happening in the world at the moment, for me,
Yeah, or any
yeah,
last
I have
words you want to
a
say.
show of visual work at the a solo show at the Lilly Museum in Reno, Nevada. I'm sure not. I don't know if much of your audience is out west in the Western United States, but who knows? I mean, maybe you have a global audience. And so I have that's something of that'll be up for a couple of months, and there'll be a symposium about my work, which is great. But some people from around the country coming and talking about what I'm doing, and that especially what I'm doing as a visual artist. So that will be a lot of fun. And then I'm doing some readings in on the West Coast, one in San Francisco and Berkeley and Vancouver over the next month or so while I'm out there. Then over the summer, I'll probably pass through the UK. I'm not sure if I'll do any events there, but I hope to. I have a book, my book Plain Sight that you mentioned earlier is coming out in Italian translation in the spring. And my new book, Coda, is coming out in Portuguese translation. So I will go do some events in Portugal and events in Italy for those things, which are a lot of fun and really interesting experiences. And we'll see what else happens. In the fall, I have another book of photographs coming out from work I've been doing in Japan for the past 10 years or so. So I'll have some shows of that stuff. And yeah, so a lot happening. Um, and this is maybe, I don't know if your audience knows, but I feel like I'd like to know what you're up to as well. What maybe you tell your audience, but I don't know what it is so yet because I haven't been your audience. I haven't known about your podcast until now. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I have a few collaborations coming up. One primarily with the Ink Collective, which is
Okay.
like a collaboration of poets and creators and from different parts of the world, but they're going to be in London,
Yeah.
showcasing uh, a book that became a bestseller. And
Hmm.
they reached out to me to be a part of the whole get together. And we're just going to have a special 2 days of it. And
Nice. When is that happening?
that's going to happen in March. And
Okay.
I
Nice.
have a few book launches, support friends of mine. So
Yeah.
it's
Great.
going to be, but we're running low on time. But this is a pleasure.
Pleasure for me as well. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care.